Hello, welcome to today's webinar where we are excited to be learning with some phenomenal school leaders from Western Sydney, as well as my colleague Sue Cridge, who leads The Connection. My name is Suzie Riddell. If I haven't met you, I'm the CEO of Social Ventures Australia, and I'll be your host today for our webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many different lands that we are joining from today. I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to the elders of the past and the present and the First Nations leaders of today and those who are emerging, and recognise all the different lands that we are joining from today. Thank you very, very much to the supporters of The Connection, some of you who I know are listening today. Thank you to the Day Family Foundation, Graham Lennon and family, the Ian Potter Foundation, the Jam Foundation, Rebecca Gorman and John Sevier, and Teachers Mutual Bank, plus many other pro bono supporters. We absolutely couldn't do it without you. We're very grateful for your support and joining us in working towards an Australia where all people and communities thrive. We are looking for more support, so if you're here as a curious learner, we'd love to talk to you afterwards. If you don't know SVA very well, we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we are working towards that vision of an Australia where all people and communities thrive. We have a very strong conviction that every child deserves access to quality education, no matter what their postcode or what their situation is. And today we're going to hear a little bit about what it's been like for some of our young learners and their families, as well as the leaders and teachers who work with them over the recent period of lockdown here in New South Wales. Remote learning has allowed many of our kids to continue with their education, which is brilliant. But for some students in communities experiencing vulnerability and disadvantage, in some cases, it really has increased barriers for them to keep up and to have continued access to high quality education and learning. And we know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected those who experience disadvantage, both the health crisis and the economic crisis. And gee, it's been going on for a long time now. It's a really crucial moment for us to learn from what has come and to think about how can we build back better? What is it that we can learn from the recent experiences and take forward with us? What might we need to do that's new? And how can we think about ways to really change the systems that are in place? Because that is one thing we've definitely seen during COVID-19 is the ability for decision makers to make pretty bold decisions that maybe wouldn't have been considered possible before. And what we've learned in SVA's history is that you absolutely cannot do systems change alone. We need lots of different players to work together. And when we support those different organisations and peoples and learners to work together, we can identify great practice, we can help spread that great practice. And that's when we have the opportunity to create ripple effects that have impact across whole systems. So I'm really pleased we're going to be hearing about what it's been really like for three of these leaders on the ground to share their experiences. Thank you so much for sharing. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my incredibly talented and inimitable colleague, Sue Cridge, who for the last 7 years, I think now, Sue, or maybe 8, has been leading the connection work. Over to you, Sue.
Well, thank you, Suzie. And like Suzie, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're all meeting from, and just call out too that learning wisdom and knowledge has been a really integral part of culture and community in our Indigenous communities. So I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging in the spirit of being a great educator and committed educator amongst colleagues here, also enter into this conversation in the spirit of listening, sharing and learning together. So I'd like just to recount by setting the scene very briefly. I'm anticipating you may have watched the short video that was shared as part of the invitation to this conversation, but I just want to recap for a few moments. There are 9,000 plus schools in Australia, about 4 million students plus served by those 9,000 schools. But what the OECD has consistently said to us over the last 10 years is that the equity gap is getting worse in Australia. It's definitely not going away. And that at the bottom 20% demographic of young people at age 15, when compared to the top 20% demographic, they are at risk of being up to 3 years behind by age 15 in terms of their educational achievement. Now, that's a really wicked issue. So when you talk about 20%, that's 800,000 young people, young learners sitting in schools and classrooms today, be it face-to-face or virtually. So that's a significant issue in our community. Now, in 2020, when the pandemic actually hit us the hardest, I think, well, it's not the hardest, but certainly reared its ugly head, McKinsey came out with a very bold statement and said that the young people not in classrooms were possibly going to be up to missing 7 months worth of learning. Fair enough, that was a bit of a red light. We were all going, whoa, stop everyone, let's got to think about this. Then Grattan actually did a deep dive into further statistics in 2020, and they were suggesting that the actual equity gap was going to triple in the period of time that young people were out of classrooms. So that was really concerning. But then in 2021, just this year, a number of academics did a bit more deep diving and scratching around the data and the evidence. And what came through was, the learning loss wasn't quite as severe for most people as had been originally predicted and reported by the media. But the problem was our most vulnerable learners were being impacted the most and certainly at risk the most. And then this data was actually further confirmed by Brookings in the US and certainly by the EEF in the UK. So Grattan and others did further investigations into some of these statistics. And some of the things that we know about include, a lot of our vulnerable learners had very limited adult home supervision and support. Many lacked the same levels of perseverance that some of their other learners in other families may have been demonstrating. And some of them were certainly demonstrating lower levels of motivation because of those compacting factors. And then you have things such as loss and reading skills that may not be quite on par. Of course, less access to technology and all the things that allow easy remote learning to happen. And then fundamental things such as job security, food security, no place to study, impacting families and what they were coping with on a day-to-day basis. Now, the Victorian and New South Wales governments in particular have really noted this and are already investing in tutoring and make-up opportunities, et cetera, but that still has a long way to go and it's really logistically complex. And then on top of that, the Victorian government has even invested $220 million moving forward for the next 4 years for mental health and wellbeing in schools. So we know that governments are aware, but it's taking time and logistical challenges that are the implications of putting these measures into play. So moving forward, there's lots of really good stuff to think about. Certainly one of my colleagues at Education Services Australia, who's responsible for overseeing technology in systems and schools, has talked about leaders taking the following approach. Really applying balance of planning and agility, being able to be responsive. Leaders really building a climate of confidence and capability. And then leaders really focusing on equity and inclusion. And then in all of that, providing safety and security. Well, let me tell you that John, Louise, and Leanne are living examples of those tenets of great leadership. And I'm really excited that we're being able to give them the opportunity to tell their story about what it is that they're doing in their leadership journeys to respond in these really complex times. There's never been a more important time to invest in high quality leadership in our schools. And I'm really looking forward to hearing with all of you from Leanne, Louise, and John as they share their insights and experiences. Thanks, Suzie.
Thanks, Sue, for painting the big picture, and welcome Leanne, Louise and John. It's so great to have you with us. John, you and I are going to spend a little bit of time chatting first, and then we'll bring Leanne, Louise and Sue back later. To our audience, if you've got questions, you don't need to wait until the end to ask them. Put them in the chat and we will try our best to respond to your questions at the end of the webinar. So, John, great to be with you virtually. You and I probably first met, I think 7 or 8 years ago, yes. And I came to visit Maryland's East Public School, and it was pretty eye-opening. Your school is not conventional, I'll give it to you. There were no classrooms that looked like how I remembered classrooms, with one small classroom and a blackboard at the front with one teacher. It was much more creative and imaginative than that. And your school is, it was, and I imagine it still is, a place of thriving imagination, curiosity, and a real commitment to learning from all your young people as well as your teachers and leaders. And I remember coming away feeling incredibly inspired about the future for those young people, and hoping that you would spread some of your learning to others in the Bright Spot Schools Connection network at the time, and now we can see that that's what's happening. But I struggle to reconcile that with the image that's in the media a lot of what home learning looked like, which is typically a sort of mid-high school age student sitting in their own room with their own desk, with their own device, with great connectivity, participating in sort of simultaneous lessons with a teacher. Now, of course, that's not probably reality, given that you and Leanne and Louise are primary school principals. But can you tell us a bit more about, you know, how did your students experience lockdown, and how different was that to that sort of media image that I just painted?
Well, thank you everyone for having me today. Just behind the scenes, there was a lot of work that was taking place, apart from what you're seeing in the media. Just a bit of context. Maryland's is in southwestern Sydney. 90% of our students come from a language background other than English, and we have 40 different language backgrounds. Suzie mentioned about the creativity of our school. Our school starts at 8 a.m. and finishes at 1:15 p.m. each day. Currently, we have 321 students, about 60 students less than we normally have, because we have a high proportion of refugees and international immigrants. And currently, because of no international travel, that has reduced our enrolment. This lockdown has been very different from last year's lockdown. Last year's lockdown was a much shorter time. Students could come up to the school. During the school holidays in April last year, I was able to open up the library. Students came in, picked up resources, took them home, borrowed books. This year, we couldn't do that. And it was a much longer lockdown. For many of our students, we had to plan work because we knew that 40% of our students do not have internet connection or a device. On top of that, we also know that when parents or families do have a device, it's often shared, and they don't have the desk or the space or the room to work in a quiet setting. For many of our families, they live in units without balconies, very limited green space, very limited space for recreational activities if they could even go for a walk. When we were told that we were going into lockdown, we were classified as 4+, a priority area. That meant that we could only have 5 staff members on site, and we had to reduce all our enrolments down to as very few as possible. So every day I would have only 2 students at school. Our learning from home or remote learning contained both writing units of work where students don't have resources from school at home. We had to use whatever was at home. There's 60% of students that could get online. We were writing units for online learning as well. But we also had to be very careful that we didn't have students online every single moment of the day. We didn't want students exposed to screen time. On top of that, our staff had a lot of stresses because they lived in LGAs that were priority LGAs. So they couldn't leave their homes as well. So here we are in a gridlock, teachers working from home, looking after their own families, also making contact with families. And because many of our students weren't online, we had to do a lot of work by telephone. It was a very different type of learning from home. We knew the disadvantage of many of our students, and we had to shift and make changes accordingly. It was a very difficult time because we also found out as time went on, many of our families picked up COVID. It was a sad time. And then we had to look at strategies in order to support families. Very different to 2020. In 2021, we knew that many of the students are now starting to wane as the lockdown got longer. Disengagement occurred in terms of learning because the resources weren't there that they normally have from school. So incredibly challenging time for all our students, Suzie.
Wow, the picture you paint is definitely one of challenges in every direction for the young people, for your staff, and for the community more broadly, given where you're located. What were some of the impacts on the students, even if they were able to connect? You painted the picture of living in a unit without even a balcony, time limits on the amount of time outside. What did happen to their well-being, their mental health, their connection with friends and community?
Well, the very first thing we had to do was identify how we were going to get our learning packages home. Initially, we dropped them off during the school holidays because we were able to do that. But after that, we had to look at Australia Post and hope they were on time. The second thing is that as time went by, we identified families that were close contacts or in fact had come down with COVID. Food security was a real issue here. We partnered up with other agencies to drop off food on a regular basis. We identified the families that needed food. Our families do not go on online shopping. If they don't have internet, there is no online shopping. Initially, they went down to many of the shops. And at one stage, a lot of our families picked up COVID from the same shop. So there was a trend there. So when families don't have online shopping, when they come down with COVID, and it was a bit of a hit and miss, the support they got from New South Wales Health, then that's where school came in to fill the breach of food security, but also trying to engage students in learning. So lots of phone calls, lots of listening, and our teachers did a remarkable job because they became more like not just teachers, but family liaison officers who could act as the conduit to myself in terms of what was going on.
And John, you shared that it's an incredibly multicultural community. How does all of that work when not everybody speaks English at all or very well, when you're trying to communicate with so many different families, including only by phone?
Well, that was the challenge that we had. We had to use the telephone interpret service quite a fair bit. But one of the challenges also that came down was what was happening in our local Cumberland LGA. And we had high incident rates of COVID in our area. At one point, we were averaging almost 300 a day. And many of those were in our school communities in itself. The challenge here was that many of our families worked on oral traditions. They would hear information and quite often misinformation from friends or neighbours or whoever. Plus, there was very limited access of information in their own community languages. Coupled with that, there was initially, in my generation, we could pick up AZ, but in this community here with younger families, they weren't eligible initially for Pfizer shots. So there was a lack of vaccine, lack of take-up, high rates of COVID, and that really challenged our community. On top of that, every day at 11 a.m, they would hear the honour roll of Maryland's Guildford, Granville, Auburn, repetitively. And then as the police and the army got involved, we were hearing helicopters, which all added stress to the community. And that made it very difficult for many of the students to engage in learning.
Oh, I mean, one can only think about being a child, hearing the helicopters hovering above, not sure where your next meal is going to come from, multi-generational household, not getting good access to information, unable to concentrate and learn. Maybe your household, or at least people you know really well, are not healthy. They've got COVID, and on top of all of that, I imagine a lot of people in your community lost hours or lost jobs or couldn't get to jobs because they were in LGAs of concern as well. And that's a lot of compounding factors for anyone to deal with. That I imagine pretty terrifying for a lot of your young learners. So what was it like when they came back to school? It's a really important part of the community. What did it look like when people were welcomed back into the school gates? What did your students miss? What did your staff miss?
Well, first of all, we had to put plans in place, and that made it more difficult because the days kept on getting changed, or the dates kept getting changed. So that was the first thing we had to encounter. But we had to put plans in place. So our grades are separated right now in different areas, so they can't mix. They leave from different gates. We were in a good position because we finish up at 1:15 every day because we start earlier at 8 a.m. But the single thing that the students tell us was they miss making memories. Memories with their friends, memories with their teachers. You know, we've missed out on carnivals. You know, school captains and school leaders couldn't do their role because they've been at home. They've missed their reading books. They've missed the school resources. They've missed our animals in our schools, our ducks, our chickens, our rabbits, our fish, all those wonderful animals that we have. They missed those memories of seeing them. It's been challenging because the children are playing in separate playgrounds right now, so they can't mix. And along with that, we're trying to get our children back into routine. However, the one positive thing about our students is that they've had disrupted schooling, many of them all their lives. If they're refugees, they've had disrupted schooling. So coming back to school, it's as though not much has changed. It's sort of like COVID has been a rude interruption because they're quite resilient. And we're putting in the support to check on our students from a wellbeing.
Wow, John, thank you. I love the human connection that the kids really are longing for, and hopefully we can deliver on that a lot over the coming months and into next year. John, thanks for sharing your experience. We'll welcome you back at the end for some Q&A, but thank you so much. And Leanne and Louise, I'd love to invite you both to share your experiences and invite Sue as well to add your insights given your convening of many school leaders. We've just heard about the impact of the recent lockdown and started to perhaps debunk a few myths about what the impact's been like on some students who live in these communities. Leanne, starting with you, can you paint the picture of what it's been like? And let's not pretend it's all in the rearview mirror, because your school's had a couple of pretty disruptive days in the last week as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Suzie. Really thrilled to be able to share the story of Auburn West, where again, we're not very close to Louisa's school and John's school, so we're in that similar vicinity. We're all been sharing the same challenges. So we're a school of around 600 students with 98% non-English speaking background, predominantly Arabic, Turkish, Dari speaking, and then a whole lot of other languages thrown in there as well. But I guess, the most powerful thing we've learned about our school community in this version of lockdown and COVID challenge is around, the 3 R's, which I sort of think about the 3 R's of relationships with our students, relationships with our community, and relationships amongst staff. I think it's just been the key thing that's helped us get through this time. I've been thinking about what we've sort of had over this period of, the last term and a half, and, we sort of had those stages that have gone through the wonderful way we operated last year in lockdown, and similar to what John was saying, we've had our school hall opened up, and it was like our community hub. People came in, they picked up learning packs, they took all the resources, we gave out pencils and whiteboards and everything we could think of to support kids at home. We were able to do that for the first week of last term. And then the rules changed pretty quickly. So we were able to we were doing fortnightly packs of learning to go home. So we'd photocopy all of the resources, we'd purchased a whole lot of things. Parents came in that first week and really loved that, ask questions, had them all signing in, showed them how to connect up the QR code on their phone as well as come into the school and get the pack. It's all sorts of things that they had to do. Which class is your child in? Some of our families didn't know that, but they hopefully know a bit more now. So it was like a drop-in centre. We had minimal staff on site. We had people teaching from home as well, but we were able to host one teacher per grade, connecting with the community, and then it moved into that next stage where we suddenly had to go from, yes, we're here to help you, to, I'm sorry, we're going to put all the information out the front of the school and you can only come in and pick it up yourself, as we became what was known as the LGA of concern in Auburn. And like John said, we sort of heard our names on the 11 o'clock bulletin every day, and not in a positive way, which was challenging. So, staff are teaching online, they're making lots of phone calls. We use a system called Class Dojo, which is like an internal sort of social media platform and learning platform. And, by the time we've sort of gone through this whole period, we've connected just about every family to our Class Dojo. So whether they read it or not, but it has been our way of being able to share learning and conversations and messages. We were teaching over the phone. We began that process of putting together, roles for different staff. So not just the class teachers, but we allocated our SLSOs, our teachers' aides, were working in small groups online. Our community liaison officers had a phone each, and they were taking phone calls and supporting families that way. Our community language teachers were allocated to a stage group, so they were supporting all our tutoring sort of switched to online learning and small group phone calls of reading and that sort of thing. But then it became even harder. It's like, we started off, okay, we've done this before, we know what we're doing. But as COVID really took place in the community, my deputy and myself were logging calls of families who were ill. We had to respond to that. We had to note that with the Department of Education, and that became a daily occurrence for us. And, that was hard to hear. We reduced down from, having a number of teachers on site down to a maximum of 5 staff, which included somebody in the office to take calls and things. So the people who were on site with the small group of students who turned up every day, that was really challenging. Those kids, how come we're at school and we're not learning at home? They found that hard. The teachers had to come. They're living in the local area, and I couldn't come on site because I wasn't living in the local area. I had enough staff. I had some executive staff, some teachers, and then my office team lived, and we could rotate around amongst those people. But they carried the burden of being on site as well as teaching their students at home. We took that opportunity to try and then support, the teachers' wellbeing as well as our families' wellbeing. So I implemented a range of activities. And wellbeing day, take a day that you're working yourself offline, making sure you're looking after yourself, doing some professional learning with a group who does life skills and supports families and things like that. It just became a harder challenge as the term went on, and I've really felt how the teachers are feeling and our community was feeling. Like John, we were distributing learning packs via a courier or through the post. We thought was going to take too long, so we spent a considerable amount of money, and over the whole term we've probably distributed about 330 packs of learning to families, and 75 packs delivered by staff as well, hand delivered in the local area. And then we gave out about 100 laptops to families to ensure at least there's one device in the home plus some data. And then we had another challenge of complexity when we had the terrible news about Afghanistan collapsing, pretty much overnight, and the impact for our community. And one of my community liaison officers is also from Afghanistan, and that added another level of complexity. So it got pretty hard. However, what a resilient, strong relationship building experience this has been. If anything, it's brought us closer together. And I think about some of the good news that's also happened along the way. And I'll just share a couple of things with you, if that's okay. We were fortunate enough to become part of the Olympics because the brother of one of my teachers was in the gold medal relay team, the Awesome Foursome. And so we all shared in the gold medal win. We took that as go Auburn West, that was exciting, things like that lifted the spirits of of everybody, we could really celebrate something like that. Those connections and hearing about what's happening for some of the kids who are learning, and the parents are feeling more connected to their child's learning. You know, it's the student, our SRC, our Student Representative Council, continue to operate once a week. They were putting out positive messages to the community. Our staff took photos of themselves holding up positive messages, and we sent those out each day. You know, it's those sort of things that we try to continue to build those relationships that I was talking about earlier, because that's been the key to survive the challenge this has been. It's been a tough time for everybody. And I really felt for my teachers who had their own children at home, and who also have, as you know, for those of you who know, the challenge of juggling teaching your own child, teaching a class, and then also trying to support a family who might be telling you the story of COVID and what's gone on for their family. It's been a interesting time.
Wow, Leanne, thank you for sharing so openly. I hope no one thought that school leaders had simple jobs before this, but what you've just shared demonstrates just how many more layers of complexity there were in the leadership challenge, and also how much wholehearted care you have demonstrated for so many different humans in the network, all the young people and their families, and the teachers and their families, and the community at large. That's a lot of people to be caring about and be worried about as this is to go through the community, and not knowing when it's about to turn the corner and get easier. Thank you very much for sharing that. I love the story about the Student Representative Council continuing to meet. That's beautiful. And the gold medal, that's awesome. Gee, we needed the Olympics when that happened, wasn't that just a spirit lifting activity? Louise, how about you? I'd love to hear more about what your experience was like, what your school's experience was like, and perhaps painting a little bit more of a picture for us about what's going on in these families. You know, it's not just one parent turning up to pick up a pack for one child, is it?
Thanks, Suzie. I feel exhausted having listened to Leanne and John, but I know that's part of our daily. It's just what we accept now. Very similar stories to both Leanne and John. If I can quickly paint a picture at Granville East here, just down the road from the two schools, you know, an average family would be mum, dad, and 4 kids, Arabic speaking. Mum and dad have been born in Lebanon and have come out here, have witnessed a civil war over there, come out, and their kids were born here. Often the parents are from a village, so they speak Arabic as well as a dialect of Lebanese. Mum and dad on average went to about year 9 or 10 at school. Dad's often a tradie, a concreter. Mum doesn't work in paid work outside of the home. They're renting about $450 a week to rent a 2-bedroom house for those 6 people who live there. In Granville, the average family is Muslim. And engages very closely in the local Muslim community. Dad would go to the mosque each Sunday with the men folk and the boys as they got older. Mum would often wear a headscarf and would congratulate her daughters when they chose to do that as well. They wouldn't have a computer or a printer at home, but have a very latest model phone, which is a great way of connecting and staying on social media. The family want the best for their children, a better life than theirs. They'd like them to move out of Granville. Many families, however, stay in Granville because they have such roots in Granville. The average Granville family maybe have gone to the city once, but don't. They're very local. They've got very tight community connections, lots of cousins and what we would call extended family, and want their kids to have things that they didn't have. And sometimes they want to give their children signifiers that redress that disadvantage that the family has been brought up with. So, you know, symbols and signifiers of clothing or brands that their kids aren't going to look like they come from any disadvantaged area. They stay in really good communication with the school, and I love what John said about that oral history. They like to phone or ring or speak face to face, which was a big impact during COVID. They wish their children could go to the local Arabic or Muslim school, but they can't afford that, so they become very engaged with the local public school. And school becomes a hub, a real hub for them, where you know, they can get information, they can get support, we can have an influence on them as well. So some of the implications, I mean, we're very lucky here at Granville East. We have 18 languages spoken on our staff. So we're able to make phone calls in Arabic and a range of different languages. We have a lot of large families. So we made our learning packs have a theme from K to 6. We started initially with poetry in place, taking up the NAIDOC week theme, and we had that ranging from K to 6, so the children working at home could do some peer learning together. We appointed a case manager for the large families, so families weren't getting different teachers calling for different children, but one point person calling to do the check-in, the welfare and the learning phone call. And, you know, we also had just a range of, I think the leadership team took on a bit of a holding environment, kind of in the adaptive work. It's called holding environment for families, for children and for staff, and some of the complexities that came out from that. But the good news is, and Leanne ended on some good news for her little piece there, you know, we continued having assemblies. We had them on Zoom. We started with not much participation, but we also gave out to 49% of our families a laptop. 10% of our families we gave Wi-Fi. It was very hard because families didn't want to lose face and admit they didn't have Wi-Fi, to give more to families. But also our kindergarten students who read twice a week on the phone to a teacher or a support person. After 13 weeks of learning from home, 80% of kindergartens are on track to meet their expected growth. And that is just all of the behind the scenes work that the staff did in order to maintain learning whilst balancing well-being, whilst balancing Afghanistan and the trauma that is re-invoked if you've grown up in a civil war and come here for a better life and there are police and army and the streets and helicopters. So, you know, just some wonderful hard work to get us through this pandemic.
Louise, thank you so much for sharing a vivid portrait of what your community is like and what some of the challenges must be, and the amount of thinking and coordination to go into how do we put the people and the families at the centre of this so that they get one family contact point rather than 4 for 4 kids, etc. That is not what is normally demanded of our school leaders and school teachers. It really is going over and above to make sure that they're really placed at the centre of the work. There must have been a lot of heavy lifting from you and your team and all of your staff to do all of that while you're also experiencing it. I think that's one of the myths in popular culture, is the leaders are removed and above and are looking down on the crisis, and not that the leaders are actually also in the LGAs of concern and maybe have COVID and have kids they're worried about or family members connect with and aren't allowed out for much exercise, etc. I'll ask you one final question before I lead to you, Sue, which is about the overall portrayal of Australia's young people and the learning. And this is going to be battered around in the media a lot. It already has started and it will continue, I imagine. And there's a danger in looking at the average of what's happened in Australia. And so you talked about lots of the data and that we've got an equity gap. So if we only listen to what's happened to literacy and numeracy results overall, Leanne, what will we miss about what the impact of this has been on learners like at Auburn West, and what might happen in the future as well? Because Sue's put a note in that your school was closed for a COVID case on Friday. There's dozens of schools across Sydney, and the same will be the case in Melbourne and in the regions as well, that are going to have these sort of in and out for a while. So what are we going to miss if we just look at the average results for Australia?
Yeah, I think that the challenge from us is, our NAPLAN data never reflects where our student learning growth is. I mean, that's always a challenge, and we've had some students doing what's called check-in assessment this week. We started that process to give us an idea formally where kids are at. But, we've noticed some incredible change, and the students have come back as, really settled, very excited to be back at school. Really, there are emotions that are running high at different points in time, but I feel like we're a school community again, and it's almost like those soft skills have really developed over time. Their ability to work more independently, to sit and listen for a longer period of time. They've had the challenge of trying to do that amongst a family, and there may be, if they're lucky, having a second device in the house, and there's some other noise in the background. And, we book at different points in time for students to learn, not just between the hours of 9 and 3. It's one of our good colleague, Jan Farmer-Haley, talks about, we teach the kids at the point of learning of wherever they're at. And that's what we do anyway. So now we're just, we're running with wherever the kids are coming back to. But I think we should be really acknowledging what the families did, because they listened to their kids read. Our teachers did that too over the phone, or, we provided some software as well that they could use. But it also meant that they're coming back, like Louise is saying, at 80%. I think we're operating pretty strongly too. And we're really proud that there were some things our families could connect to, but we haven't done our 6 curriculum areas. We haven't covered everything we're meant to tick off. Our focus is on, are they emotionally ready to be back at school, and can we support their learning in literacy and numeracy? Yes, that's important, but it's also the what else.
Love the strengths-based approach of what has worked really well and what's improved. Louise, what about you?
I would concur with Leanne. I think Sue started with painting a picture of some of that research, and I think what we've done as a leadership team, and we met once a week during the whole time to just have that far horizon and to strategize. Once you know about what some of the additional vulnerabilities may be, you can then manage risk and you can plan around that. And we really planned for academics, social emotional learning during the lockdown as well as the return. So I too can see these wonderful self-directed, resilient learners return, which is something we're really going to build upon. But also when children returned, we had this mantra of no testing, no talk of learning loss, and building relationships. So we kind of came up with some goals, and it was based around some leadership work we've done. And so I think looking at the whole child, looking at we're not cramming any gaps. These children have come back to us having done some different type of learning, having done some really hard emotional work. If Dad's lost his job and there were no tradies happening across Granville, they've now got Dad at home. With the additional, just stress in the household, and they've managed to keep connected. So I think it's, we come from a trauma-informed approach to our curriculum here. It's that social emotional learning, that how can we build resilience and then work on the skills and the capacities in literacy and numeracy in order to do that.
Beautiful. I love that you banned talking about learning loss, because that's certainly not a strengths-based approach, and relationships first, so that there's, I imagine, much deeper psychological safety, so that kids are ready and able to engage. In Leanne, Sue, you have led the connection for many years, and nothing prepared anyone for COVID, but gee, the model of work and the support that was required had to change pretty radically. Can you tell us about what's the connection been like over the last year or so, and in the recent lockdown, and what comes next?
Yeah, that's great points, Suzie. And look, we are so proud to be working with Louise, John, Leanne, and in fact, about 65 other schools who have similar leadership teams doing the really good work in the places where it's really needed most. So as you know, the Connection is an initiative of Social Ventures Australia. It's a concept where we look for high quality leadership and opportunities to build the capacity of systems to address equity and excellence. So it's a systemic approach around connecting leaders. So in the case of Louise, John and Leanne, they've been very active participants in our weekly care sessions. Care not standing for that, for them, but more so collaborating and reflection energizers. So once a week, it was a drop-in where they would pop on for an hour at their own discretion if they needed it, and simply share stories and share insights, share strategies, and share processes that they were putting into play in their locations. And might I add, it was really interesting because our South Australian colleagues were having quite a different experience to our New South Wales and Victorian colleagues. However, there was synergies and lots of energy and support. The other things that we've been doing is, in fact, still convening our collaboration opportunities online. So we've done a complete agile flip, a bit like the leaders. We had to think differently in the space, and consequently going online has had its benefits and its challenges. Its benefits from the point of view more members of the leadership team can get access to the events and the opportunities and the speakers, etc., and the opportunity to speak to each other. But the downside being there's nothing that can beat a face-to-face chin wag and a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or something. So thinking about how we do a hybrid version into the future of the work that we've been implementing. And then further to that, we've developed, with the very generous support of the Ian Potter Foundation, an online collaboration platform, which is a first, and we've had enormous amount of interest from colleagues across the education systems in Australia about what we've achieved, and we're putting that into play as we speak. So that's been also a really great opportunity. But Suzie, I really want to call out the power of dynamic leadership. If it hadn't been for the leadership of Louise, John and Leanne in these communities, things could have gone very differently for these kids and their staff. And I want to call out the power of leadership in systems and the value of connecting expertise and leaders across systems in order to build the capacity so we can see this real change grow and impact at scale. And so the Connection is poised to scale. We're currently working with 69 schools in 3 states, and we're in deep negotiations around expanding that with a view to get to 400, which is, a very audacious big goal, but we're on track to get there, maybe a little bit slower than what we had anticipated given COVID. But more so than ever before, the power of leadership and the importance of this work to address excellence and equity across the Australian education system has come to the fore, because the pandemic has shown us quite convincingly, working individually is fine and good, but tell you what, when we connect and actually do it in unison, the impact is much, much greater. So connection is really critical.
Thank you. It is indeed an audacious goal, but imagine if there were 400 of the kind of leaders that we've just heard from Louise and Leanne and John, all connecting and sharing what they're learning and being support to each other. Your job sounds frankly hard as hell over the last little while. Like I feel like I want to give each of you just a giant hug to say thank you, and I hope you're going to get a really great break over summer, because you're going to need it. I heard this analogy that we're all a bit like broken, not completely broken, but just old iPhones where the battery looks like fully charged, but it only lasts till morning tea time instead of through the whole day. So I hope everyone gets a bit of a battery replace over summer. To our audience, now's the time to ask your questions. If you'd like to type a question in, and if we're able to, we'll try and answer them now. If we're not able to, we're happy to follow up after. You're also welcome to contact us afterwards if you'd like to be put in contact with anyone or ask questions later. I'm interested in, philosophically, where should we invest if we are philanthropists? Because all three of you talked about the challenge of devices and connectivity, of food, of really the hygiene factors for what it takes to be fed and ready to learn and able to learn. So that's clearly very important. And yet, Sue, you're just talking about investing in the leaders. So we've got the right capability and capacity to be able to do all the remarkable things that you just shared. And ideally, we want both. But why is it, maybe Sue, you can kick off, and if the rest of you have a perspective, feel free to jump in too. Why is it so important that we invest in leadership and not just in the things that really address the acute crisis at the time?
It's a great question. And I think when you really think about the massive job ahead in terms of addressing equity from a systems perspective, we need a sustainable sustainable strategic step forward in terms of maintaining the momentum of any improvement initiative. And with all due respect to my colleagues in state education systems, the investments often tend to be short-term and very reactive as opposed to proactive. Now, we could argue about that, but I would certainly argue from deep experience in the education sector over a long period of time that high quality teaching is a no-brainer. Of course, we need to do that. And I know that the education profession is committed to doing and delivering high quality teaching. But high quality leadership, particularly in those most complex communities, can enable or disable high quality teaching. And that is really critical. And when I refer to teaching, that goes beyond just classroom practice. That goes to creating a culture conducive of engaging the trust of the community and the ability for families to support their learners at home. But even more broader than that, developing young people that have the skills and attributes and qualities supported by their teaching staff to thrive in their future lives. So I would suggest that investing in people like John, Leanne and Louise to maintain the momentum, to really build their expertise and insights and keep looking forward to evolve this work to where it needs to be, is where the sweet spot in the system is for equity, to address equity. Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. And such a reminder from these stories today. Yeah, the departments of education can do a lot, but they have such scale to address. And I remember when Mark Scott came and addressed an SEO event a couple of years ago. He used to run the New South Wales Department of Education. He'd talk about, we have 2,500 schools in New South Wales. The job of the department is just to make sure they're operational every day. They can't be responsive to the need that's actually there in each school and in each community. That's the job of the team who are there at the school level, which is what you've demonstrated today. Chris, I'm going to go to Chris since he's just jumped in, about how big an issue the difference in capability and progress in normal times, so helping the fast learners advance without constraint while helping the slower learners move as fast as they can, and how are you finding this now? Interesting. So John, would you like to talk about this and perhaps paint the picture of kind of what that looks like in your school prior to COVID and whether that's different now?
Well,
Chris.
It's a great question, because one of the learnings that we've come out of COVID is that, we need to be mindful of what education in turn we call cognitive overload. That means that students are learning so much, but they can't really absorb it. And that's what could happen during the COVID lockdown. Our students never had as many extracurricular activities as maybe other students, so they didn't miss those. But what they did miss was time to reflect and just chill out. And our students got that. And the lesson that we've learned is that, you know, as the more we give our students the time to reflect and chill and take their time, the better they actually learn. So this year, we heard a bit about Louise's NAPLAN results and Leanne's check-in assessment. 70% of our students were in the top 2 bands of NAPLAN. It may be different next year because this lockdown's a lot longer, but when you're talking about 70% from a disadvantaged community, that's pretty good. But it took a team to do that, and we've been able to build in small support or small group support for our students that were struggling, along with extending those that have come out of lockdown in terms of their learning program. We've addressed where the students have got gaps, and we're making good progress with that. So we're not, you know, I don't want to use the old, I think it was the George Bush mentality, no child left behind, but in many ways, that's what we're doing, whether it's a social, emotional, and academic notion that we're addressing. So there have been challenges there, but the department has supported us with a COVID intensive learning support program that will continue next year, whereby we can have almost like a tutoring program within our school.
Thanks, John. And with our commitment to evidence and measurement and learning at SVA, I ideally hope that they really assess to what extent do those programs and extra investments work, and in what context do they work, so that we can keep them where they're needed going forward, because these are not just things that need to be in place in response to COVID. Often we've got these kinds of situations happening in lots of communities anyway. So if they work well, we could really learn from that, and where do we get good learning dividend for the investments. So I'm interested if you have a question for our leaders before we wrap up our webinar.
Sure. I'd love to ask Leanne, Louise and John, and this is a bit of a tradition at in the Connection cohort, to provide 3 words that summarise your biggest learning. Well, maybe 1 word for your biggest learning and 1 word for your biggest wish moving forward.
Oh, I think for me, it's the relationships are powerful. That's what we've had, and you know, I told Sue a story the other day, which was, I'm going to go off from the 1 word, bad luck.
They do this regularly to me.
That one of the families rang one of a young teacher, an early career teacher, to tell her that somebody had passed away with COVID. And she was one of the first people she called, and the teacher rang me to report it, and she just didn't know what to do with that information. If that doesn't say that the relationships have developed incredibly strongly, I don't know what else.
Thank you, Leanne, for sharing that.
Yeah, mine would be personalised. I always thought we were good at very, individual learning, but we personalised learning for every child in Connection. And my wish for the future is to maintain that personalisation.
Okay. I would say agile leaders needed, because there's no courses in university about school and a pandemic. No teaching course called School and Pandemic. If you think last year our schools had to flip overnight, our teachers had to flip. No one taught them how to use Zoom or Teams. There was no course that you could take straight away. We just had to learn it straight away. And also about being agile, because the department gives us guidelines. 2,000 schools, we're all different. How do we put those guidelines in to mitigate the risk or reduce the risk of COVID in our school environment? So that's why we need agility.
Brilliant.
You are just superstars, can I say that? I'm just so grateful for all of the incredible leadership that you display day to day, but also for your openness and candidness with us today. Thank you. So I'll hand to you for our final wrap up.
Thank you, Suzie. And might I add that each of these schools is doing extraordinarily well on their traditional NAPLAN, not that any of them would admit to that necessarily very openly. However, you can see it takes more than just a traditional approach to address the complexities in these communities. Look, we're looking for partners to support this journey, this really important opportunity to build the capacity of leadership across our education systems in Australia, because we believe the answers to move forward sit within our expertise that sits within schools across communities in Australia. There are many wicked issues that we need to address, and leaders are leading the work at the coalface in classrooms, in communities every day, and can make a difference, just as Louise, John and Leanne have indicated today. We are looking at systemic change, not just one school at a time, but we're looking at big systems change. And we would be delighted to share more details or talk to you further about how that might work moving forward into the future. Government conversations in this space are very live. There's lots of commitment and opportunity to really impact what's happening across different states and jurisdictions. And we certainly thank Louise, John and Leanne for their ongoing work, and all the other leaders out there across Australia doing the same thing. It's really important that we support them, and we look forward to having conversations with any of you if you'd like to learn more, or certainly join in the charge to supercharge, I suppose, the efforts that these leaders are taking in our communities. Thanks, Suzie.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who's joined us or who is watching us on the recording. It's our pleasure to work with these leaders and to showcase some phenomenal work in education. And we look forward to sharing more with each of you, and hopefully a particularly bonanza version of lots of those things next year in 2022 when SVA turns 20. With that, thanks very much. Thanks, John. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Louise. Well done, Sue. And we'll hopefully connect with you soon. Bye.